The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, or in many cases, good morning still, depending on where you're joining us from. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Amy Omang. I'm with ASPA. I'm here to help facilitate today's session, and I want to thank everybody for being here. I see several new names, not faces, new names on the call. I want to welcome you in, and I want to say thanks for being here, as well as some other regulars that we have. But given we've got some new folks, I want to just take a few moments before we get to the meat of why we're here to have a couple housekeeping announcements, primarily regarding what you see and hear in that control panel on your screen. So a couple things you can navigate here depending on your preferences. On that larger control panel, the orange arrow is going to, if you click on the orange arrow, that will open and close the larger control panel depending on your preferences there. And then also there's the circle with the square inside of it. That's going to allow you to change your viewer mode between full screen and partial screen, and you can adjust it the way you'd like to see your screen. Okay, one more thing that's pretty important. So we're going to have a chance to ask questions or make comments with our experts today. If you'd like to speak verbally as opposed to written communication, we'd love to hear your voice. So that hand icon that you see there will let me know that you'd like to speak. At the appropriate time, I will unmute you. I'll call you by first name, and we'll go from there. Okay, so a couple other things on that larger control panel, primarily the questions pane. Back to what I just said about opportunity for questions and comments. If you'd rather speak written communication versus verbally, that questions pane allows you to do so. So just type in your comment or question. We will answer it at the appropriate time and go from there. And last thing, if you have any technical issues or any administrative questions for me, just type them in there. I'll work with you on the back end and hopefully get them resolved. So, all right, so I'm really looking forward to this today. So excuse me, meat of why we're here. So we've got 3 experts and co-authors who are joining us. So I want to say a very big thank you, first of all. Co-authors, Trevor Brown, Matthew Potosky, and David Van Slyke. I'm going to make a really brief introduction. These guys, you want to hear from them and not from me. So I'm going to make it really short and sweet and then turn it over to them. But let's start with Trevor Brown. He's the Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University. Matt Potosky is Professor of Corporate Environmental Management in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And Dave Van Slyke is Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. So we've got some big names, big expertise here. I am happy to turn it over to Trevor Brown. Trevor, thanks for coming to actually accepting our invitation, and we are thrilled to have you here. So I'll turn it over to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Amy. I know I speak on behalf of Matt and Dave when I say thank you to you, Amy, and to all of you in the audience for spending an hour with us to talk about complex contracting. I also want to thank a couple other people before we get started. The presentation is derivative of an article we wrote for Public Administration Review, and we certainly want to thank Jeremy Hall and Paul Battaglio, the 2 editors, and the anonymous reviewers for the critical feedback they gave us on this piece. So we're excited to share with you some of the things we've learned. And before we do that, I'll just elaborate a little bit more on the 3 of us. Matt and Dave and I have been good friends and colleagues for over 15 years working on contracting and contract management. Dave and I come with some professional experience in the contracting world, albeit many, many years ago. But fundamentally, we're scholars. We're academics. But we're all academics in professional programs. And one of our goals with our research broadly is to make our research usable and accessible for managers, for those who actually have to do the good work in the world of trying to create public value for their stakeholders and the citizens of which they serve. So that's very much the spirit in which this article was written, and Public Administration Review and ASPA are great venues for that kind of work, that intersection of scholarship and practice. And so this presentation today is in that vein of trying to make some of the research that Matt Dave and I have been engaged in for many, many years accessible and usable to you and to the others who would consume this at some other time. So our goals today, I'm going to just elaborate on those a little bit. First is to provide a general guide to managers about contracting for complex products and identify the sort of vulnerabilities and risks that go along with contracting for these types of products. What causes those risks? What are the sources of what gives rise to the challenges of complex contracting? And then finally, the kinds of management practices that one can engage in to hopefully ameliorate and mitigate those risks and get the best chance at getting value out of an exchange for a complex product. This is primarily a framework we've developed and an accompanying set of strategies for managers, for those who will be responsible for managing programs that are reliant upon products that are sourced from the marketplace to deliver value to their stakeholders. So we know we've got some practitioners on the line who work in the contracting, procurement, and acquisition space, and we're thrilled to have you here. But we should say, in terms of truth in advertising, when we crafted this piece, it was not specifically for contract personnel, but rather for the people that manage that function or manage the programs that are dependent on some kind of input into their program delivery. So do keep that in mind as we're presenting today. Sometimes procurement personnel don't have the kinds of discretion that a manager might have to structure and craft the acquisition. They may be more restricted by the rules and processes and procedures that guide them. And some of the things we're going to talk about today suggest a little bit more flexibility sometimes than people in the procurement profession have. But the hope is for those of you who are procurement professionals that you might see this as a guide for how to educate and inform those who manage this function or those who manage some part of an organization that is dependent on procurement to succeed in the delivery of the program's goals. One of our large goals in the kind of work that we do is to raise the prominence of the procurement profession, to not treat it as a back office function, but rather to highlight its strategic managerial importance. And so this article and this talk today is in that vein. The second goal of today's presentation is to demonstrate that complex products go beyond the kinds of things that we're typically accustomed to. Most often when people refer to complex products, they think of things in the defense and national security world. The major rockets and missiles, and the image on your screen is an unmanned vehicle that can launch missiles from miles and miles away from the actual person operating the vehicle. And some of you may be familiar with some work that Matt and Dave and I have done before on what amounted to a complex acquisition of a defense product to some degree. That was the Coast Guard's Deepwater acquisition. And there are plenty of products in that defense space which fit into the complex definition that we're going to describe to you earlier. But one of the purposes of this article was to give some examples of other kinds of arenas in which complex products are acquired. Most often, a key characteristic of many complex products, or not so much an attribute, Matt is going to talk a little bit about in a minute, but information technology is often prevalent in the kinds of products that we're talking about. In the article, we highlight at the very beginning the Affordable Care Act's reliance on healthcare.gov, a website that did not roll out as intended. And we frame this as, on the face of it, just the acquisition of a website. Well, it turned out to be the acquisition of something far more complicated than that. and information technology customized to a certain user is often at the root of the challenges that we see in the complex contracting world. So other examples, and some of these we highlight in the article, are transportation systems. The planning and infrastructure crowd refer to these as mega projects. We highlight Boston's Big Dig, in which they were tunneling underneath existing infrastructure and trying to create a seamless integrated transportation system that went beyond just roads and tunnels and bridges, but rather used information technology to provide information to users and operators of the system to try and achieve goals of improved efficiency, reduced congestion, fewer accidents, et cetera. Another area in which we see complex products increasingly acquired is in the healthcare space. So many of you are probably familiar with an increasing effort to create wraparound healthcare systems in which we go from worrying simply about the delivery to the actual consumption of the product at the user level. And so rather than thinking about the user going from one service provider to another, it's given the conditions that a patient faces, how do we knit together all the services they might need to get healthy? Again, information technology is often at the root of trying to connect the different service providers together, and the acquisition of those kinds of products amounts to acquiring a complex product. So again, one of the things we were trying to do with this article and today's presentation is go beyond just simply showing you that this is a defense national security issue, but this is prevalent across levels of government and across different arenas. So today, the next 50 minutes, for the first 10 minutes, we're going to talk about what it means to contract for a complex product. Matt is going to tackle this section. He's going to talk about what we hope to be the outcomes of any exchange, the classic win-win. And then he's going to distinguish between what we refer to as simple and complex products. And in doing so, he's going to elaborate on some of the thinking, the framework that we utilize to diagnose what the challenges are. Then we're going to transition to those management strategies that I forecasted. There are 4 of them that we articulate in this article. The first is understanding the product and its attributes and risks. The second is crafting win-win rules. The third is building a reciprocal relationship. And the fourth is achieving mutual understanding. Dave's going to tackle those first 3, and then I'll finish up with the 4th. And then I'll finish by summarizing our presentation today for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. If you have questions throughout this presentation, by all means, shoot them to Amy, and she'll vet them in the sense that if they're quick, easily answered questions, she might pop up and say, hey, Matt, Dave, Trevor, I've got a question that just needs a quick clarification. But if they're more substantive ones, we'll save those to the end and tackle them afterwards. And if by all means we run out of time and you have a question that you'd love to follow up with us, Matt, Dave, or I would welcome you reaching out to us independently, and we'd happily chat with you about it then. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Trevor. When the 3 of us started working on this project and doing research in this area, we were struck by something that we saw that the academics were writing. When academics were writing advice for public managers responsible for purchasing and contracting, the advice seemed to be checklists of things they should do. And we asked ourselves, if we were buying things, would we always want to follow this advice? And the advice didn't always seem to fit. And we think that's because the advice was sort of one size fits all. And contracting practices, we thought, had to be different if people were buying different kinds of products. The second thing we noticed is that a lot of the advice that was going to practitioners didn't seem to draw on what academics have to offer. Academics spend a lot of time studying how people buy and sell things and interact. And some of what academics study can be helpful for people who are doing practice. So we noticed this difference. We'd ask ourselves, if I was buying milk at the grocery store and followed the advice that was given to contract practitioners, would I buy milk any better? Or if I was buying services from my doctor or from my auto mechanic, would I do anything better following this advice? And so the first thing we noticed is that things needed to be different the advice needed to be different depending on, and the practices need to be different depending on what people were buying. So we looked to social science and economists and management scholars to say, how do we categorize the things that people buy? And we kind of drew on that to develop this distinction between simple products and complex products. So when people buy things, both sides, the buyer and the seller, want to make themselves better off, right? So the buyer wants to pay a price for a product and receive back a product that's more valuable to the buyer than the price the buyer paid, right? So when buying milk, if milk provides $5 worth of value and I pay $4 for it, then I've received $1 in value, and that's a win for the buyer. And likewise, any seller wants to sell a product and receive a price and receive a payment that is higher than the cost of bringing that product to the buyer, right? And so with that seller, hopefully with the gallon of milk, produced it at less than the $4 sale price, maybe $3, so that seller comes out with a win. And really we can think that, and this, a lot of the listeners may have had an economics class and think back to Adam Smith, the hidden hand of the market. This is the great win-win when each side looking to make themselves better off enter into exchange and they both come out better off because they've exchanged resources in such a way. Now, these win-win outcomes can happen for most readily for simple products. And the simple products are like paper clips. And with paper clips, the buyer can easily state what they want. So they know exactly how they want the product to form, what its features would look like. Maybe they want multicolor to lighten up their office or something. And so they can evaluate the quality and the different quality dimensions of the offerings in front of them. So they can look at the paper clips and know exactly what they're getting. And secondly, neither the buyer nor and so sellers can easily make products that match what buyers want. It doesn't take a whole lot of work to figure out how to make a good paper clip and match it and do different variety of paper clips so that the buyers can get exactly what they want. So that's one feature, is that everybody kind of knows exactly what they want and what they want the product to perform, and we can get a nice price. The second feature is nobody has to do anything all that special to make the exchange happen. So a paperclip seller doesn't customize paper clips for a particular buyer, doesn't modify it. They don't have to go any extra effort or spend any extra resources to sell the paper clips, nor do the buyers have to exert any special effort to buy a particular style or type of paper clips. And so this is what we call simple products. Everybody can describe what they want in advance or produce products that fit, and nobody does anything special. Now, there are other products, and these are the ones that have probably people spend most of their time, that we call more complex. Now, by complex, we don't just mean or necessarily mean that these are big products with a lot of intricate, moving, interconnected parts, right? What we mean by complex is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the buyer to fully explain all the qualities of dimensions that they're looking to purchase, what the features would be, what the trade-offs among different features are, what they're willing to pay for different combinations of features and quality. And since the buyer has a hard time being specific about what they want, it can be difficult for the seller to know. The seller may be working with uncertainty as well, not knowing how much it costs to produce different quality dimensions, different features. In our aircraft example, different trade-offs between the speed with which airplanes are relaunched and maybe the holding capacity of the aircraft carrier and so on, or the speed that the aircraft carrier moves. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what people want, the different trade-offs, the different circumstances, and the different costs. And so in these situations, this means that the contract for buying these products is often incomplete, right? Because we can't say exactly, the buyer can't say exactly what they want. Instead, they make general statements of the parameters. A second feature of complex products is that they require specialized investments. And the specialized investments means that the buyer and the seller both make investments and spend resources to make the exchange occur, and those investments lose value if deployed outside the exchange or if the exchange doesn't occur, right? So this could mean something like a buyer has to train its staff to learn the seller's specialized software, and this often happens when we're buying computer systems. The buyer trains its staff to do that, and if the buyer ends up not buying that software, then all that time and effort spent training the staff is lost because the staff need to learn the new software that ends up being put in place. Also, sellers need to make special investments when they do a lot of research and development work to figure out what kinds of products might work or what kind of features may work together. So when we have these two conditions in place, we have a complex product that produces an incomplete contract. And the contract's incomplete because we don't know exactly who's going to be doing what the final product will look like. And there's this asset-specific investment. We call it circumstance what we call lock-in, where the buyer and seller are both kind of wedded to each other in a sense. They're connected to each other because each will lose value if the contract isn't completed. And they're also, in a sense, exposed to risk. And the risk is what we call in the behavior, the risk arises in the behavior between the two parties. So one set of behavior is we can have consummate behavior where each side tries to live up to the win-win spirit of the contract, to make the contract perform as if both were going to be better off. And sometimes this could mean foregoing a bigger potential gain that one party might have to ensure that both sides receive a yet bigger gain. Conversely, there are opportunities, because there's this lock-in in an incomplete contract, there are opportunities for perfunctory behavior, where either side can use wiggle room in the contract to advantage themselves, to produce greater gains for themselves, but at even yet greater expense for the other party, right? So the other party experiences yet greater loss. And this is the risk we see in a lot of contracts where a seller can cut corners on quality, perhaps saving their own cost, as an example, but the buyer loses an even greater value that they would have received. Had they been able to negotiate a more complete contract and known that these circumstances would occur, they could negotiate that, but now they're kind of stuck with this lock-in where that kind of renegotiation can be difficult. Conversely, buyers can also perform perfunctorily by holding the line really firmly and make the seller have a really high cost to produce some additional feature that really only has a marginal little extra value in gain for the buyer, and the seller ends up bearing this big cost. So in these circumstances, we can have the risk of contracts going poorly. So the question then becomes, what can be done to manage these complex contracting scenarios so we can get closer to the win-win outcomes that we want? And that's where Dave and Trevor, starting with Dave, will pick up.
Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate the transition. So one of the things that we think about when we think about the framework that Matt has just laid out, part of it is diagnostic. But as Trevor said at the beginning of the presentation, it's not enough to diagnose the problem. The real challenge then is, what are a set of strategies managers and contract personnel can use to actually mitigate these risks and actually move forward to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes for both parties. So on the next slide, we're going to see that we look at the issue of understanding the product. And as Matt laid out, there are big differences between a set of paper clips, a box of paper clips, and an aircraft carrier. When we think about these challenging contracting issues, part of it is really coming to terms with what is it that we're buying? How easily can we specify what it is we want to buy and the terms and conditions of the purchase? Matt's illustration of paper clips is a really good example, but we know that folks in government at every level, federal, state, and local, are buying many things. And as Trevor's earlier presentation pointed out, it's things that you might think of as complex, like an aircraft carrier, but it's also transportation systems, information technology systems, and so forth. So knowing the product is really important, but knowing the product means really being able to distinguish between what we can actually specify, what exists in the market, and can we actually transact for that? And then looking at ourselves and really better understanding, can we make this ourselves, or do we need to go to the market and buy it? Now, in some cases, as Matt said, academic literature and theory would have you look at most decisions like this and say, sure, go to the market and buy paper clips, but something as complex as an aircraft carrier, you should make yourself. But as Trevor was noting earlier, it's not so easy to just say we're going to suddenly make this, right? Part of what we have to ask ourselves is, does government have the capabilities? Does it have the expertise? Does it have the technology? And does government itself want to take on all the risks of producing something for which it may not know at the current state what its ultimate demand level is? So one of the things that we think about is that those in government have choices to make, and the question is, do they go to the market and buy something, or do they make it? And we would argue that in a lot of these types of complex contracts, where it's harder to specify every detail that you want, and as Matt noted, there can be a high writing cost. So where precision is often prized because you're trying to account for every contingency, there's a downside, which is you can try to create a very complete contract, but then those issues that you do leave out that were hard to specify in terms of requirement, or require certain kinds of investments on the part of the vendor, having a contract that's more incomplete will actually allow for more cooperation, discretion, and flexibility. Now, there are lots of examples out there. This isn't the only one. In the article that Trevor and Matt have both referenced, we use a case study of a Navy airplane called the Avenger II, the A-12. And at the time, the government thought, well, look, this is an airplane, right? And General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas at the time, they were already in the aviation business, and especially within the defense space. But one of the things that was not observed very closely is that a lot of the new technology and features that the Navy was asking for were actually far beyond the current state capabilities and maturity, the technological maturity that those firms had worked on. And so when it's easy to sometimes mistake a complex product for a simple one because you think, sure, these are airplanes and there are lots of different manufacturers of airplanes. So one of the things that we always want to think about when we think about knowing the product is really being able to think about, how difficult is it to specify the requirements? How easy is it to measure and observe the elements of the product that are being developed or are not? How specialized is the investment that a seller, a vendor, the contractor to the government has to make? And in each of those cases, it can require both research and development, which if there's only one buyer, such as the federal government for an aircraft carrier, those can be sunk costs that are hard to recover unless government, as the sole buyer, what economists often refer to as having a position as a monopsonist, if you don't separate those, right, it raises the question about, are there conflicts of interest? Do you begin to then, misrepresent your own capabilities? And does government actually have the capacity to be able to look at some of these issues? As Trevor noted earlier, through our own research and data collection, we looked at an example of a complex product, healthcare.gov, which at the time was mistakenly assumed to be a simple product because it was a website. And folks said, look, everyone builds websites. How hard can this website be? But then what they began to understand is 50 states, multiple exchanges, different rules within the legislation itself, pulling from many different data sets, being able to respond with options and market pricing, and the availability of the technological interface to make accessible information that actually is pretty complex to the average user. So one of the things that's really important as a managerial strategy is before we start contracting at all, or the decision to contract, let's ask ourselves, how much do we know about the product? How much do we know about the characteristics of that product? How much do we know about what we're going to need in terms of level of demand or scale or quantity, and how much of a market is already developed, and what are the capabilities of the market to be able to meet that demand? Knowing the product is one thing. Being able to create a set of rules that actually guide decisions for both party, the buyer and the seller, so government and the contractor or the vendor, is really important. And in our research, we look at 3 different types of rules. The first are what we call product rules, and those are rules that really, as we've just illustrated with both the aircraft carrier and the paper clips, talk about the nature of the product itself. The exchange rules are a bit different in the sense that it really looks at compensation requirements, and government has many different tools and avenues on which to purchase different goods and services. And so, for example, it could use a time and material contract, it could use a fixed price contract, it could use a cost plus type of contract. But here, part of what we're doing is describing how the vendor is actually going to be compensated, and more specifically, who bears the cost of different types of risk, a delay in the schedule, a cost overrun, an element of the product that actually does not contribute to it performing as we'd expect. But once we get, some of the product and the exchange rules written, then we have to really ask ourselves, how are we going to work together? And it's that working together that really gives rise to what we call governance rules. And in those governance rules, what we're trying to set is some procedures for how we're going to work together. How often are we going to exchange information? How often are we physically going to meet? Who's going to make decisions? Who has the authority for decisions? Under what conditions does one party have more authority than the other? How much risk can we take before we have to actually interact with the other party to make some decisions about how a product or a service is actually going to be developed and then actually put into place? Now, at the federal level, we have something called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and those really speak to the first set of rules about products, and they give some guidance on the second set on exchange in terms of thinking about how to reduce uncertainty. But again, I want to go back to what Matt said earlier about incomplete contracts. Sometimes when you try to write every single element out, what you begin to do is in the search for precision, you've actually complicated the nature of being able to move forward with issues of flexibility. And it's in that flexibility, right, that we think about what these rules are going to be, how we assign authority and responsibility, and really it's moving then into something that we would call much more relational. So a contract, right, relationship that's not just transactional, that goes over a period of time. And in that time period, what we're looking at is how to share decision making around risks and rewards, how we're really clarifying responsibilities and accountability, but how we're creating more opportunity for cooperation. And it's in that area of cooperation that one of the things that we do is we think about how to have repeated interactions with one another. And so what you're going to see on this slide is the more interactions we have with one another, the better we're able to both gauge how the other party works and exchange information. Now, one of the challenges in this, right, is making sure that we both can observe and understand one another's behavior. And that proves to be a little bit easier in theory than it is in actual practice. It can be hard to really discern, why did the party make that decision with this information under this set of conditions? Now, what we can do to be able to mitigate some of that uncertainty is that we can actually build in this kind of repeated interaction. We can try to leverage organizational reputations, both as a positive and as a negative. And it's in those reputations that we can give rise to the idea that, having a good and consummate and productive relationship can lead to positive reinforcement of of a good reputation, but really if we begin to pursue our own goals at the expense of the other party, it can lead us to a more negative reputation. And that's where it's important to have not just vigorous and transparent oversight and accountability, but it can even be helpful as a managerial strategy to thinking about who are those third parties that can perform some level of independent validation and verification. Can we, the buyer and the seller, agree on them? And can we actually take their feedback and use it productively to find ways to get to that win-win relationship? Trevor's now going to transition us to bring this full circle.
Okay, our fourth strategy is a somewhat abstract one, achieving mutual understanding. So what Dave has just laid out is a trio of strategies that are sort of functional in the sense that step one is know the product, understand its attributes, its risks. Step two is to craft that contract in a way that promotes cooperation by specifying decision-making authority, and who bears the risk of payment, cost overrun, et cetera, in a way that both parties are incentivized to cooperate. And then the third is structuring that relationship in such a way that the parties are repeatedly interacting. So rather than it just being a one-off, sort of off-the-shelf purchase, you're structuring the interaction such that the parties come together again and again and again, and that repeated play disciplines cooperative behavior. But underlying all of this is a need for both parties to understand the actions and behaviors of the other party. Complex products, as we've heard throughout, require many things to be left unsaid. So contracts are incomplete, and a lot of the success of a contract for a complex product is born of the interactions between the two parties. So that puts a heavy premium on both parties understanding the behaviors in the way that Matt described them earlier. If I am the buyer and you are the seller, and I intend something in a consummate way, but it causes some harm to the buyer or to the seller, they may come away feeling like that behavior was perfunctory or harmful to their interests. And hence see that I'm not operating in the spirit of the contract. And sometimes it's just the sort of fog of uncertainty that comes from these kinds of interactions. But sometimes it's just a general lack of understanding of the terms and behaviors that go into an exchange. So we highlight an example in the contract, or sorry, in the paper, of NASA's acquisition through the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of a satellite. This was the Mars Climate Orbiter that was to orbit around one of the moons or around Mars in the late 1990s. And the contractor and the vendor or the purchaser sat down, walked through, designed a contract that specified as much as possible about the terms of the exchange, the governance rules, the product rules. They built mechanisms in to achieve some degree of repeated play. And lo and behold, some months after the launch of the satellite, it makes its way to Mars. And then as it's orbiting Mars, it unfortunately crashes into one of Mars's moons and is lost forever. So all of this planning, all of this preparation, gone. And the reason was not because one or the other party was operating nefariously, but because they were literally using different measurement systems. One was using the English system and the other was using the metric system. So the literal calculations that they had put in place to put the satellite into orbit and then ultimately monitor and manage its launch and orbit proved faulty, proved wrong. They were using different numbers or different systems of measurement. And so this example is one of many in which both parties had good intentions, both parties were trying to do things in the right way in the spirit of the win-win, but they literally did not understand the terms of exchange in the same way. So what are some things that you can do to achieve that level of mutual understanding? So some are you can co-locate. You can spend time together working on the project simultaneously, so you are learning from the other side about how they speak and use the product. Similarly, you can use that contracting process to develop a common lexicon, basically words that you can write down and describe them to each other such that you spend time making sure that they're understood in the same way. Another frequent strategy to try and build mutual understanding is to hire somebody from the other entity, essentially a translator or an ambassador. So you could get a retiree of a vendor to come in and be on board your procurement shop, so that when something arises, you can turn to them and say, wait a minute, what's the intention here? Is this someone trying to behave opportunistically and take advantage of me? Or is there some other thing going on here that I'm not seeing because I'm not familiar with this interaction? And these are particularly important steps when the two parties have never done business together. And that's often the case in complex contracts. The buyer, the government, is often buying something that they've never purchased before, and hence have never entered into a relationship with this vendor. And so in those instances in which you are buying something that is totally novel to you and to the vendor, it is even more important to spend that time building mutual understanding so that terms and behaviors can be understood similarly. So now let's wrap this up and open it up to questions. So Matt spent the first part of the presentation identifying the risks associated with contracting for a complex product. Those risks are born of the two key attributes of a complex product. That's difficulty in specifying the details of the attributes of the product and its performance requirements. We often think of this as the requirements definition phase, and that leads to an incomplete contract, combined with that need to make specialized investments that are unique to the transaction and not easily deployed to other transactions. That creates the risk of lock-in and creates the opportunity for one or both parties to do harm to the other and undermine that win-win outcome possibility. So then we identified 4 strategies that we think managers can undertake to try and mitigate or ameliorate those risks. The first is know the product and its attributes. The second is to create win-win cooperative rules that promote that cooperative spirit of the contract. The third is to structure the relationship in such a way that there are repeated interactions. That's the reciprocity that comes from interacting time and time again to try and discipline cooperation. And similarly, creating opportunities for reputations to play a stake. And here you're betting on the prospect of future interactions, not necessarily in the exchange, but in future exchanges. So if there are instances in which one party does the other harm and other potential partners become aware of that, they may not want to do business with that party. And hence making the transaction as transparent as possible disciplines cooperative behavior. And the fourth and final strategy is to spend time and effort to achieve mutual understanding so that both sides understand and can interpret similarly the actions and behaviors of the other. Our argument is, and our framework suggests, not that these are the keys to success, but rather that these are the steps that increase the likelihood of success. Complex products, the contracts for them are fraught with risk. They are inherently risky, and they put that win-win outcome at risk. Our research suggests that those exchange partners that spend time to put all 4 of these elements in place have a greater likelihood of achieving that win-win. Take any one of these away or fumble any one of these, and the risks of a lose outcome for one party or both increase. So with that, we'll thank you for your attention and would open it up to any questions that you might have. One or all 3 of us would be more than happy to enter into discussion and engage some of the things we've raised with you today.
Great. Okay, thanks, Trevor and all. So Just a refresher as to how to ask a question. We do have a hand raised, so I'm going to go there first for the verbal question, but you can also type in your questions or comments in that questions pane. We do have a couple in the queue, so we will get to those as well. But first, let's see. Jay Paul, would you like to ask a question? I see your hand raised and we've unmuted you. Are you with us, Jay Paul?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I actually sent it in too, but I hope this isn't off base, but I'd be very interested in any comments or observations, expectations, or whatever regarding the process and the recent awarding of the $10 billion JEDI contract to Microsoft.
Dave, I'm going to let you tackle that one.
Yeah, so thanks so much for your question. I mean, as you know, the JEDI contract was challenging because there's both a limited number of vendors that could really be able to complete the project to the scale, but also because DoD was really looking for the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure Initiative to be able to capture certain kinds of risks on the vendor side. And then finally, I think, you know, the bigger challenge here is because something like this doesn't exist, there's a limited number of sellers who can do it. And because, I mean, you know, even when you look at how long the contract is, it's a really complicated, you know, RFP itself, and many elements of it were still left incomplete. And then finally, you know, I think there's the question of, you know, whether there's political interference, and that got adjudicated in a couple of different ways. One, you had a rotating succession of defense secretaries and acting defense secretaries. You had questions about appealing and having the GAO come in and do an assessment of the bid protest. But it's also the question of, you know, what government's options are from a timeliness perspective, given that so much of the cybersecurity and information migration to the cloud is considered to already be far behind schedule. So I think JEDI is a really good example of both a complex contract, one in which there's, you know, it's not that government's not going to buy others of these types, but this is the most ambitious of what the federal government has proposed buying in terms of migration to a secure cloud environment. But then secondarily, that there really is a limited market of potential vendors with the demonstrated expertise and scale and operational capabilities, and that created some real challenges. The political environment certainly did not add to that and obfuscated some elements of transparency, and I think we probably still have not seen a final decision on this as it moves forward.
Great, thank you. Anybody else wanted to take a part of that, or should I move on to the next question?
No, Dave's given you a great answer.
Awesome. Okay, great. Okay, we have a question from Joe here, who says that my experience shows that the primary key to any successful contracting experience, whether simple or complex, is for the government to manage the contract effectively. So he's wondering if you might grant his premise and explain where the view fits into your 4 strategies.
I'll happily start, and I'm sure Dave and Matt may have some things to offer as well. And first off, Joe, I see it, Joe Pagnato, great to hear from you and have you involved in this conversation. You've had a lot of experience in this space before. So I will certainly grant you the premise that the government managing contracts effectively is going to increase the chances of a win-win. I think one way to interpret effectively is sort of following the procedures and practices that are conventionally accepted as to leading to success. In the case of simple products, I think that's more straightforward. Following the guidance in the FAR and expertise that's been generated from years of acquiring similar kinds of products is absolutely going to increase the chances of a successful outcome, both for the vendor and for the purchasing government. The challenge when it comes to complex products is that the sort of steps and rules and processes, sort of what Matt was saying at the very beginning of his portion of this presentation, following those checklists for effectiveness only get you so far because there's so much uncertainty associated with the contract. Inherently, contracts for complex products will be incomplete. There are limits to how much the requirements can be defined. There are limits to how much monitoring and oversight, for example, will be able to generate the information to discern definitively, oh, we got what we wanted, in part because it's hard to specify exactly what you want the product to do at the outset. We have plenty of examples of where purchasers have to leave things vague in order to entice a vendor to enter into the arrangement and hence launch the exchange. Now, at the same time, as we've done our investigations into other kinds of complex products, there are plenty of examples in which government procurement officials and their vendor partners diverge from what we would think of as conventional practice. And that often leads to, as you suggest, negative outcomes. And so at any given moment, your best course of action is to follow what is expected for effective performance. But again, the challenge for a complex product is you're going to have plenty of gray areas where both parties are going to have to get together and work some things out sort of on the fly often to move the contract forward at any given moment. Dave, Matt, I don't know if you have anything beyond that you'd like to share.
I guess I would just say quickly, I mean, I think, Joe, the antecedent operating assumption is, in fact, that government's going to manage the contract effectively. But I think there's substantial evidence that depending on the type of product or service that government broadly, not just the federal government, is buying, right, that there's often a question about what's understanding the business case, having an appropriate risk posture. And so I think, as Trevor notes, that while a few of our case studies that we use to illustrate this framework for decision making draw from examples of federal contracts, it's just as much the case that we're looking at state and local governments. And I think it's fair to say that there's uneven procurement and contract expertise in terms of infrastructure and capacity by state and local government.
Joe, your question's so good that you get all three of us answering. And so I'll just add that part of what we're suggesting is there are circumstances where the existing practices and regulations for contracting would change. So in some circumstances, government purchasers can be compelled to not take into account a vendor's past performance in other contracts in evaluating a proposal or a bid. And here we're saying there's a big cost to that, because what we're suggesting is that we should incentivize vendors to perform consummately, to perform in the win-win spirit of a contract by giving them the opportunity to show that they'd be good partners in future contracts. And so part of our framework, we think, has a bit of policy prescriptions for what the regulations are for contracts. Good question, Joe.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, great question and great answer. So we have a couple more in the queue here, and so let me move on to the next one. So question here, or I guess comment here, that so some of the examples, many of the examples you used are for big purchases by federal agencies. Is this really just a challenge for federal procurement personnel, or is it relevant for state and local personnel as well?
Dave, you want to jump on this one?
I'm sorry, Amy, I did not quite hear you. You went out
Sure.
there for just a second. Would you mind repeating the question?
You bet. Okay, so many of the examples provided here were for big purchases by federal agencies. So the question is this really just a challenge for the federal procurement personnel, or is it also relevant to state and local personnel as well?
Sure. I mean, I think it absolutely is. You know, when you look at some local governments, you look at New York City, the largest local government in the nation, a lot of what they're trying to buy in terms of an integrated social safety net really cut across many different agencies, so cross-agency, but also requires the integration of many different forms of data. Just trying to create that kind of a system that would get real-time data, historical data, and be able to integrate it in a way that that allows a caseworker to make a decision about benefits is actually a pretty complex product. When you look at what some states are doing, especially in the upper Midwest, you see, some parties that are very strongly engaged with professional organizations like NASPO, and one of the things they think about doing, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, is they think about bundling. But recently they've had a big contract proposal around bundling for 5G services. And in fact, that kind of a contract, even if 5G is relatively straightforward from some people's perspective, it's complicated in terms of distance, space, density, who gets how much access and under what conditions. And this is especially relevant as some of those states actually lead the nation now in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. So it's not just the introduction of drones for a range of public safety and agriculture and fire preservation, but it's also then how the bandwidth becomes available and how there's sharing mechanisms. So I think these example of complex products are not limited just to the federal government and certainly not limited just to the defense space, but have broader applications at the state and local level as well.
Amy, I'd love to just jump in on Dave's good answer. So Dave's given some great examples of the kinds of products that states and localities are increasingly buying. But there's also a more abstract way to think about this too, and that complexity really is a function of your experience and your capacity as a procurement professional or procurement unit in your setting. And so complexity for the complex products that we've described may not be purchased in every locality across the country, but localities may be increasingly asked to buy things that they are not familiar with purchasing and don't have a ready marketplace to get information about trade-offs between different kinds of products. So it often is the case that when a government is being asked to do something, to acquire something they've not acquired before, even though in some other setting in the country, the federal government or the state level, that may be buying those kinds of products routinely, there may be some that say, well, that's a pretty easy purchase. But if you yourself don't have the experience and the processes and procedures and practices in place, it may be complex for you. And that's why that first rule is so important, is to take a breath at the beginning and say, how much do I know about this product? How much do I know about the market from which I would acquire it? And if I can answer that affirmatively by saying, oh yeah, this is something we've purchased before, or I can define the terms of exchange fairly easily, I can write everything down in the contract, and there's very little risk of getting locked in, fine, let's move forward as we've done in the past. If on the other hand, you get those signals, wow, this is something new for us, and it's something we're not familiar with, boy, I better think through those other steps that we were talking about earlier.
Great, okay, so excellent. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for the answers. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and that does take us right to the top of the hour. But let me turn it over briefly to all three of you for any final comments.
So this is Trevor. Just thank you very much for the opportunity to help to share the things that we've learned, and hopefully these have proven helpful to you. And again, as I said at the very beginning, Matt, Dave, and or I would more than happily engage in conversation with any one of you offline. Send us an email and we'd be happy to chat.
This is Dave. I'd just say thanks very much for this opportunity, and I really appreciate all the people who stayed and participated fully, and great to be back with my colleagues. And Amy, thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity, and we learn a lot from responding to questions and interacting with people who are on the front lines, like many of you are. So please feel free to reach out to any of us. Thanks.
Excellent. So I'll echo the thank yous. Thank you to all three of you for your expertise, your time, and for sharing it with us. Really appreciate it. And then, of course, to the audience, thanks for your time. We know how scarce it can be. So as we exit here, a very short, I promise it's less than a minute, a very short evaluation form. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again, and I mean it. We do read it all. We try to act on what we can, and we try to improve what we can as well. So we appreciate your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you all again, whether it's here or live. Our conference is in April, so I hope you all keep your eyes open for that. So wish everybody a terrific afternoon, and thanks all. Take care.